This is North Pod, a North Melbourne fan podcast, hosted by Jason Hunt.
Stevenson with his own move. Carrington. North are in front.
Hello and welcome back, listeners, to North Pod. We are a third of the way through the AFLW season already, if you can believe that. 4 games down, 7 to go. Before the home and away stuff wraps up at least. And we've got a bit to talk about in this episode. We're going to touch on the big win against Port Adelaide on Friday night or Friday afternoon. And as well as some AFL men's related news with some delistings and player movement talk. So fair bit to get through. Bumper episode, as you would say. It would be ironic if I said, not a lot to talk about in this episode. So certainly talking up as you might expect, but let's jump right into it. We're going to start with the AFLW stuff, and we'll talk about the postseason men's stuff at the end of the podcast. So team selection for this game against Port Adelaide. We went in unchanged. There was some talk in the lead up that Libby Birch might have some sore ribs, maybe even some broken ribs, and that she might not play, but she did play and looked like she has for the season so far. Would have been unfortunate if she did miss, as she's one of the AFLW players that hasn't missed a game yet. So yeah, fantastic that she was able to get up and play still. We went in unchanged from last week's big win. It'll be interesting to see if that continues, given we've got some short turnarounds in the next couple of weeks. We know we're playing again on Wednesday and then another game on Sunday. So it's 3 games in 9 days. It's a very busy time. I would expect that we'd at least see a little bit of change, probably some minutes being managed during the games as well. So that's going to be an interesting watch, but no changes for this week. Our match result had us winning 6-6-42 to Port Adelaide, 1 goal straight, 6 points, so a 36-point win. And I mean, look, all the damage was done in the first half. We'll talk about it in a minute, but if you didn't see the game, it was played at just after 5 o'clock, Whitten Oval. A little bit windy, pretty cold, and at halftime, the rain just settled in. It absolutely bucketed through all the third quarter and a big chunk of the last quarter as well. You could see a little bit of lightning in the distance as well. That was awful weather. So we fortunately were able to put on a big score in the first half. We actually led 41-0 at halftime. And then the weather changed and the game changed as a result. So certainly we were lucky that we were able to get off to that quick start. Really dominated the first half in terms of possession, in terms of contested possession. The ball lived in our half of the ground. There wasn't a lot for the defenders to do at all. It would have been very low inside 50 count for Port Adelaide in that first half. It was good that we were able to get that done before the weather came in. And I guess moving into story of the game, I think despite the fact that it was a very comfortable win, there were a couple of just little worrying signs, I suppose, or maybe a bit of a trend that we can see developing. We know in the Geelong game, where the weather wasn't as good and it was windy and wet at Arden Street, we ended up not playing a very good second half, and we're pretty lucky to get away with the draw there. And same story here, not to the same extent because we were out to a big lead, but the second half we ended up losing 1-6. That's what we scored 1 point and Port Adelaide scored 1 goal, and that was all the scoring in that second half. The weather was atrocious, so I want to put that on the table. I'm not expecting that we're going to put 41 points on again, but the fact that there's a bit of a trend here where when there's some inclement weather, we're unable to... Our game plan, I suppose, doesn't seem to hold up. That the way that we like to play with that play on and dangerous kicking and run and carry doesn't hold up in the wet for probably a couple of different reasons. You know, a part of that comes from the fact that there's less marks, and so you've got less opportunity to take a mark and then give the hand pass to someone like Carney running past. Hand passes, we know, become a bit more tricky when it's wet. So yeah, it's a bit of a combination of us being really sloppy in those conditions and not having as many players maybe that can adjust to those wet conditions, but also our game style really just doesn't translate, and we haven't been able to adapt well enough, I don't think, to play to the weather. So yeah, when that torrential weather arrived, the game really changed, and it actually spent a lot more time in Port Adelaide's half of the ground in that second part of the game. And whilst they were only able to score 1 goal, certainly they had the play, and we didn't really look like scoring for large chunks of that second half. So it is a bit of a concern that when the weather turns, our game style fails, essentially. We've seen that against Geelong, and we had that again against Port Adelaide. That's something that I'd be looking at. Is it that we need to completely shift gears when the weather changes? Do we just need to make a couple of subtle changes? Because it's everywhere. It's our ability to get contested ball and turn that into productive play and productive possessions. We don't have enough clean players in the contest to get it out. It's also that, we are quite a tall side, and so potentially because of that, when the weather changes, we're a little on the tall side. Like, there's a few different ways you can look at it. It's certainly noticeable to me, though, that our players go from being a fumbly kind of player 1 out of 10 times to being more like 9 out of 10 times. And you just don't want your drop to be that dramatic when the weather turns. Obviously, we all acknowledge that you're going to be less clean when it's slippery, so totally understand that. But the drop-off seems to be quite significant, and we don't have as many players that can handle it. So that's just something, I guess, that we probably need to look at out of this game. It's now a bit of a trend. We're fortunate in this one that we're able to get out to a big lead and then defend it. But, if we're playing a final and the weather does turn, you want to know that we've got some strategies that we can employ to still win us the game. So that to me was the big takeaway. Obviously still a big win and a positive game overall, but that's something that I guess caught my eye. And the commentators were talking about it a little bit as well. They were talking about the fact that if you do want to be a side that wins the big finals, you have to be able to adapt, and potentially this is a weakness of our game. So that's one to watch. Let's have a look at the 5 stars. If you're a new listener, this is where I will give votes to the 4 best performing North Melbourne player and the best opposition player, with 4 going to the best on ground, 2, 3, or 3, 2, 1 for the North Melbourne players, and then just a mention for the best opposition player. And all of these votes come together for the North Podium at the end of the season to show who was the best player according to yours truly. Tough game to evaluate, because really after half time it was such a sloppy nothing game that we only really had a half to see which players were having an impact or having a big impact. So 4 votes I think had to go to Jazzy Garner, because she was hot when the game was tight early on. She had a really fast start, ended up with 30 disposals, 1 goal, 2, 8 tackles, 9 clearances, nearly 600 metres gained, and a goal assist. So, we know that her and her midfield mates are going to fill the stat sheet, but I thought she was super impactful in the first half when the game was there to be won, kicked a goal early and had those really penetrating deep kicks into the forward line. Also was super, super physical, had a massive hit in the second half that was totally fair, just a really big sort of push off or bump off a player who was trying to kick it. We know she's elite, so another massive game from Jazzy Garner. It's weird to think that she's kind of had a bit of a slow start by her standards, or probably slow start's harsh. She hasn't been an out-and-out best player every game, and so therefore it feels like she's had a bit of a quiet start, but as you'll hear in a moment, she's actually now leading the North Podium, or sitting atop the North Podium after this best on ground performance. So she was fantastic as always. I've given the 3 votes to Mia King, and it's a bit of a reward for effort thing, but she was also fantastic in this game. She's been unlucky to miss the last couple of weeks, and there's been reasons for that, but I thought 21 disposals, 17 tackles, 4 clearances, just a contested beast. She was immense at the contest, better with disposal in this game than she has been in previous weeks. That's been the one thing that's let her down a little bit, is her effectiveness. And I thought that she was a bit cleaner, particularly like I said, in the first half where the conditions were more conducive to, finding a teammate. Once it really got wet in that second half, the story kind of shifts, because at that point you're just trying to get the ball forward at any cost. And yeah, I thought, like I said, first half she was fantastic, adjusted pretty well to the conditions. Like, given she's a contested player, she didn't seem to be too bothered by the really wet conditions. And I mean, 17 tackles. I mean, what more do I have to say? We'll talk about the tackling a little bit later on, but she just loves the physicality, and fantastic game from Mia King. So her first votes for the year, but she's definitely been, pretty close to polling in previous rounds. So I did want to reward her for her consistency there. It's not often that you're going to see a player with 17 tackles. So massive game from Mia. 2 votes, and I think after this game, I think I have to crown her as my favourite AFLW player. Alice O'Loughlin, 15 disposals, 2 goals, 1, 6 tackles, 4 inside 50s, and she just continues to hit the scoreboard and be dangerous in that front half. I love the aggression and the confidence that she plays with. Now and then she will get caught because she's taking the game on, but by and large, she's able to evade tackles. She ducks her way out of trouble and just, like I said, hits the scoreboard, kicked another 2 goals. She's already up to 6 now for the season from her 3 games. She's never kicked more than 8 goals in a season, which she did in the second season of 2022. She kicked 8 that year, so the fact that she's already up to 6 says that she is in for a big year. She's been consistently kicking goals and looking dangerous in that front half. She did go off at one point with what looked like it could have been an injury. We thought arm at one point, but then it seemed to be thumb. She came back on with some strapping, so I guess we'll see during the week if that's amounted to anything. But then, in addition to that, she also might be in trouble for a sling tackle, which, look, to me, it was borderline. It wasn't a complete sling. She kind of let go of the player halfway through. She won a holding the ball call for it and then played on pretty quickly, and we definitely scored from that chain. I think it may have been a goal. Personally, I loved the aggressiveness of the tackle. I thought that she did 90% of it right. She probably did go on with it just a touch. So, look, it'll be interesting to see what happens. The Port Adelaide player didn't hit their head in the end, but I guess it's the action was conducive to potentially causing injury. So, look, we'll see what happens there. Hopefully it's not another suspension because we know that she copped a 1-week suspension coming out of round 1. We don't want a repeat of that, but yeah, I think 2 votes for her. If I was getting a number on my jumper at the moment, I'd be getting number 6 for Alice. She is immense, and just like I said, love the way she's playing with that confidence and evasiveness and aggression. And then, as always, it's hard to pick the last one because it does mean that you're missing a couple out. But I mean, how could I go past Ash Riddell? Unlucky to be down getting the 1 vote, 30 disposals, 2 marks, which doesn't sound like much, but in the conditions, there weren't many players marking it more than twice. 13 tackles, 3 clearances, 4 inside 50s, 9 intercepts. Just did what she always does. I think because she played it in a little bit more contested and in tight, probably her impact on the game was a little bit harder to measure than normal because often she's getting it in tight and also playing the running game. She was more contested, and you'd expect that in a game where the conditions were so poor. She had 20 contested possessions, most on the ground, and was pretty clean given how wet it was. So, like I mentioned, she was pretty unlucky not to get the 1, but I just thought her impact was probably not as directly observable as it usually is, or it has been in the first couple of weeks, because she has been on fire. The 9 intercepts shows that she was, getting in the right way and playing that defensive-minded game as well. And I mean, yeah, look, 13 tackles, not far behind Mia King. She had a great game. She loves the contested stuff, Ash, and yeah, another great game from her. So her and Jazzy Garner continue the 4-game streak thus far of both of them polling in the opening 4 rounds. In terms of a couple of unlucky players, I mean, look, half the side was fantastic in that first half. It would be pretty easy to give some votes out, but I thought Ruby Tripodi had a really good midfield game, 15 touches, 13 tackles, kicked a goal, and is really developing in that midfield. Still on limited minutes compared to, the others in there, but there's only so much time to go around. You can't play Mia King, Ash Riddell, Jazzy Garner, and Ruby Tripodi all in the middle at the same time. There's going to be some rotation happening there. I thought she played a great game. I mean, Emma Carney off halfback, 16 touches, 9 intercepts, was also great. Again, better in the first half when the game was more on our terms, but both of those easily could have been getting a 2 or a 1 vote. Very hard to pick the best opposition player just because they really did not have a standout. I've gone with Abby Dowrick, who I thought was probably their best, but she was super inefficient with disposal. I think, with the weather, it's kind of easy to understand that, but yeah, she really didn't have many mates that were competing with her or really at all. Like I said, it was really hard to find the best Port player. She had 18 touches, 8 tackles, 2 clearances, 7 intercepts. So battled away, but yeah, certainly would be probably 9th or 10th best on ground, I would say. It was really hard to find a Port Adelaide player that, won their position, so to speak. And yeah, I mean, part of that's probably the fact that the second half, I didn't completely discount, but it was just so hard to measure player performance in that second half. The conditions were so bad. You really do have to have a look at it and look how thick that rain was to understand just how bad the conditions were. So Jazzy Garner, the 4 votes, Mia King 3, Alice O'Loughlin 2, Ash Riddell 1, Abby Dowrick the best on the field for Port Adelaide. In terms of what the standings look like now for the North Podium going into or coming out of round 4, Jazzy Garner, like I mentioned earlier, now sitting atop on 12 votes. Ash Riddell only 1 vote behind on 11. And then a big drop down, but none of these players have been bad at all. We've got a good spread down here. Alice O'Loughlin and Kate Sheelaw on 4 votes. Emma Carney and Mia King on 3. Libby Birch 2. And Talia Randall 1. So a good spread down there. We've only had 4 games, so considering the fact that Garner and Riddell have polled in all 4 of the games, to have another, 6 players that are polling is fantastic. And yeah, I mean, we know it's a much shorter season, so it's going to be tough for players to catch Garner and Riddell already just because of the fact there's only 7 home and away games left, but I do imagine we'll be able to take this into the finals. Don't want to speak too soon, but our ladder position is looking pretty favourable at the moment. I'm recording this Saturday afternoon, so Adelaide's yet to play, but we're going to be sitting either first or second after this round, with St Kilda losing to the Hawks. So we're looking pretty good for a final spot, and we should be. We should be one of the best sides in it. So anyway, that's the North Podium chat. Before I go to the positives and negatives, I do want to give a quick call to action. Please follow me on social media at NorthPod Show. Instagram and Twitter or X are the 2 places that you'll find me most active. Subscribe to me on any podcast service or on YouTube where you can find the podcast. And also, if you do appreciate the show and you'd like another way, you can support the show on Buy Me a Coffee. Like I've said all year, I don't drink coffee, but I will pick myself up a nice Coke or a nice sugary drink. That's more my preference. So if you're keen to support the show in another way, that is available to you. But I thank every listener that I have. The best way for you to support the show is to listen, and I really appreciate it. Let's talk through some positives and negatives from the game. And I mean, I already talked about the biggest negative, and that was our inability to adapt to the conditions. So there is the worry there that when the level drops and it's more of a sloppy game, are we able to play that sloppy, get it forward at any cost kind of game? Are we too tall if the weather is wet? There's certainly adjustments we could make there. We know that we're playing Rennie, King, Randall, and Sheelaw as forward half potential players that are pretty tall. So potentially you could lose one of them. Don't know who it would be, to be fair, because you probably still want to go in with the 2 rucks. Maybe you decide that you're going to take Rennie or Emma King out, and you're going to play Randall as a second ruck. That's a possibility. It'll be interesting to see, I guess, if we do rest some players over the next little period, if they do experiment with a slightly smaller forward line. But I think if the weather's good, our forward line is one of our strengths, with given how tall and physical it is. So anyway, I guess all of that is to say that our ability to adapt is a little bit of a concern, but I did touch on that in the story of the game. I think another thing was that this is the first game for the year where we actually lost the ruck. It was marginal. It wasn't a massive distance, but I do think that the Port Adelaide ruck women had our measure. We lost the hitouts 44-35. We did still come out on top in the clearances, but we're going to do that most of the time with how strong our midfield is. So, take that for what it is. I just thought our rucks were slightly beaten. King did make up for, I think, with some really important groundwork around the groundwork. She made a contest several times. Forward in particular, she just brought the ball to ground and refused to be outmarked, refused to let the Port Adelaide defenders, intercept the ball. So I thought that she did a great job around the ground, but in the actual ruck contest, the Port ruck women had some great tap work. One to watch, I guess, if whether Liz McGrath comes in the next couple of weeks. She's been an emergency, I'm fairly sure, for all 4 games this year. She's got some experience. She's played some games at Port a couple of years ago, but is yet to debut for North. So I'm not suggesting that King and Rennie are in bad form or anything like that. That they weren't smashed. They just had not as good a game. But I do wonder if potentially the next couple of weeks is a chance just to get some minutes into Liz McGrath and see if she, is ready in the event that one of those 2 goes down with an injury. Another concern, I guess, I mentioned it earlier, is Alice O'Loughlin and whether or not she's going to miss with either injury or suspension. Personally, that would be a big concern for me. I just love watching her play, but she's also so important for the forward line. She's adds a pretty irreplaceable element with the way that she's evasive and aggressive and attacks the footy. So hopefully she's okay in terms of that arm or thumb injury, and hopefully she's able to avoid suspension, because the form that she's in this year, I do not want her missing another game. And then the only other negative really that I could draw out of it is the game, particularly in the first half, was really slowed down by the umpiring. 15 free kicks in the first quarter, 40 for the game, so it didn't keep up at that extremely high clip. But yeah, I just thought the way that it was umpired really interrupted our flow at times. It made it difficult for us to keep the momentum. And sure, we kicked 41 points in the first half, but it could have been a lot more if not for the umpires. I don't want to say they were getting involved. I just think that they were, blowing the whistle for a lot of 50-50s that are often not paid, and it did slow the game down a little bit. And we know, given the way that time on works in the AFLW, the clock only stops for most of the quarter if it's a goal. So often if there's a free kick and the ball's having to be reset, all of those sorts of things, we are losing time. It was a pretty stoppage-heavy game as well on account of how contested it was and how many tackles were happening. So yeah, that slowed our game down a little bit, I guess, and was a little bit frustrating as a viewer. But look, when you come away with a 6-goal win, I think we're grasping at straws. We're not really concerned about those things too much, but I do think it was worth noting that it's not as if we were slaughtered by the whistle or anything like that. It was being called both ways. We did end up with more free kicks. It was a really stop-start game, particularly in that first half when the weather was better, to be honest. Let's have a look at the positives. There was certainly some positives to draw from the big win. I mentioned it earlier, with Mia King, who was a tackling machine, but 129 tackles for us for the game. Now, obviously, it's pretty contested and tight when it's wet, but 129 is a massive, massive number. We were just fanatic. We did not let Port Adelaide breathe at times. They had 91 tackles themselves, but, smashed them in the tackle count by 38 rather. In a shortened game that AFLW is, to have that many tackles is crazy. Our contested game was nuts. And in general, it just looked like, we were applying immense pressure on Port and they weren't applying much on us at all. In reality, of course, they were trying, but their ability to corral and actually land the tackles was not as good as ours. In tight, we just didn't let them have any space. Anytime they were disposing of it from a clearance situation, it was a quick kick or hand pass. They didn't have time to assess their options. And really, I think the big difference or the impact on the game was Port had so few uncontested possessions because every touch they had was under pressure. They only had 38 uncontested possessions for the game, which is crazy, crazy low. We had 102, to put that into perspective. So ridiculous pressure by us. Obviously, Mia King was leading the way with that tackling, and Ash Riddell was fantastic as well. There was plenty that were doing the hard work in there. And then in terms of us getting the ball in a contested situations, Garner, Riddell, Mia King, Bella Eddy, Bruton, Randall was 7 of the top 8 contested possession players on the ground. So yeah, our contested game was fantastic. And at least we know if the game does get wet, we know those players can get their hands on the ball. It's just then, are we able to have effective enough disposals with it at that point? So that's probably the question mark, but we know that we're strong over the ball. We keep our feet when we need to. And yeah, it was absolutely fantastic to see. There's definitely some elements of that game that I think the men could take some pointers from the girls, because they were fantastic. And I'm just going to say that again, 129 tackles. That is a crazy number. Certainly well over our season average. And again, I understand the conditions contribute to that, but you also still have to have the skill and the want to tackle, and that was certainly on display. I thought at times our defence did get a chance to show their work, particularly in the second half. There's been times in the Brisbane game and in the Melbourne game where our defenders really haven't been asked to do a whole lot because the ball hasn't spent a lot of time down there. But I thought, the second half, the ball did spend a fair bit of time in our defensive half. Port went inside 50 22 times for 1 score. So I think that tells a big story about the way that the defence was able to completely shut out, strong, good opportunities for Port to score. Their 1 goal did come from a free kick. I don't recall if it was a holding decision or a high tackle, but it was certainly a tackling issue that resulted in a free kick. I mean, yeah, the defence just looked really well connected. I thought Jazzy Ferguson was really assured with her closing speed and her spoiling. She looked technically really sound. Sarah Wright was clean, kept her feet in contested situations where she needed to. Thought Libby Birch and Bresnahan did their jobs. Bresnahan was probably a little bit better than last week. Looked to have a bit more awareness of, the space that she did or didn't have. And these are the kind of reps that we're going to need these defensive players to have for when we play when we play Adelaide in the coming weeks, because we do know that when we play the better sides, the ball is going to spend some time in our defence, and we're going to need those players to know how to respond and how to react. So I think, obviously, the conditions made it a bit odd, but I thought when the ball went in there, our defence did a fantastic job of playing defensively, and it doesn't necessarily reflect well on the stats sheet, or you're not looking at the game going, gee, they were best on, but they played the role that they need to. And yeah, I mean, I just feel so safe with Ferguson and Wright and Birch playing those taller players. They're just really sound defensive players. Doesn't mean that they're going to do flashy things and come away with the ball and rebound it, but that's why we've got players like Carney down there, like O'Shea at times, those players that can run and do some flashy things with the ball. And we've got those players that are just locked down and don't let their opposition, get away with anything. And then the last thing to touch on, I guess, moving more broadly and going beyond just the defence, I think even though it wasn't the perfect game and we really only played, a half of really good footy, I think most of the players were still playing their roles. I mean, I'm going to reel off a couple of players here and just talk about the impact that they did have on the game. And it's the sort of impact that you want from those players. They're doing the best of their role. So Talia Randall was super physical. She just bodies players for fun, and you're going to have more opportunities for that in the wet. I thought she was fantastic in that role. It was another game where she didn't necessarily hit the scoreboard and have a massive impact with the footy, but I thought her body work and her physicality around the contest was fantastic. Taylor Gatt, who we know has been a little bit up and down within games this year, I thought had another good game on the wing, had a great moment finishing off a team chain of handballs. She ran across from the fat side, got on the end of some handballs and was able to have just a tap-in goal from the goal square. But that's what you want your winger doing. You want them, holding shape, and then as the ball gets closer and closer to the face of the goal, that's when they can close in and then be an option out the back, which is exactly what she was. I thought Bella Eddy had a couple of good opportunities where she hit the front and center of the contest. Kate Sheelaw, again, the conditions didn't necessarily suit her, but she played in front, and that's what allowed her to mark inside 50 and kick her goal. Vicky Wall, her intensity and pressure was elite. Only the 8 touches, but had 2 goal assists, and it was crucial to locking the ball in our front half in that first half. So, I could go through every player, but you get a sense for all of those players, those things that I named, they're the things that you want them doing. That's what they're in the side to do. And they were doing a super good job of those things, particularly early on in the game, when the game was there to be won. And to be honest, the game was wrapped up, midway through the second quarter. But the only reason for that is because everyone was playing their role and being super efficient and damaging in those roles. So a super game from the girls. Great to remain undefeated through 4 games. And we go into a busy time with a couple more games in quick succession in really, really good form, which is super exciting. So we'll have a quick look at the news from the week, which is going to be focused on the men's side. I guess one main thing and then a couple of smaller things. We had our first round of delisting. So Biggie Nyuon, Hamish Free, Curtis Taylor and Tyler Sellers were all delisted. Biggie was delisted with a contract, so I don't profess to know whether or not we've sort of arranged on a bit of a payout, or if we're just going to pay him for next year not to play, or if he's... like I said, I don't really know what's happened there, because he did have a second year, but he's going not to be off the list for next year. And I think, looking at that list, I have no complaints. I think Biggie, for me, just didn't have the AFL attributes in terms of football skills. We know that Hamish Free was really just there as, ruck security. You've got to have a player like that. So potentially now with Finbar and Goad, we've got those players that are, able to come in a pinch if things go really pear-shaped in terms of injuries in the ruck. Tyler Sellers, unfortunately, just it didn't work out for him. I feel bad for him, only playing the 2 games and really barely getting a touch, but it is what it is, unfortunately. And then Curtis Taylor, I guess, is the interesting one. I think of those 4, he's the one that you could potentially see getting picked up as a delisted free agent by someone else. Hopefully he doesn't end up like Mason Wood. Well, I mean, look, hopefully he does for his sake, but for our sake, you'd love to think that he's not going to be able to make it work, and hopefully it wasn't an us thing, it was a him thing. But yeah, I could definitely see a side picking him up for a bit of wing depth or half-forward depth. There's certainly AFL potential there. It just, we weren't able to unlock all of that potential, unfortunately. His development seemed to really stall after 2022, I would say. His last couple of years have been pretty average. So, look, hard to argue with any of those delistings. I think it's good to get that first batch out of the way. I doubt it will be the last round of delistings. I think there'll still be 1 or 2 players more potentially off the books. So currently it's just Drury, Cooper Harvey and Lazaro now without contracts, and I expect that they'll probably have to wait until during the trade period now, and it might depend on how many players we trade in and out, and therefore how many draft selections we want. Drury's on the rookie list, whereas the other 2 aren't. So, I could see a reality where potentially one of those maybe gets moved onto the rookie list. We're also unsure whether or not we're going to get those extra rookie selections again from the AFL. So there's a few things to be worked out there. I probably would expect one of those players to remain on the list and the other 2 to go a little bit later on, but we'll have to wait and see. But yeah, that's the big news. I'll probably unpack the consequences or my thoughts a little bit more on those delistings in future weeks when we get up to the draft and trade periods. And then I guess, shortly after I released my last podcast, Jack Darling did officially ask for a trade. There'd certainly been rumours and talk that it was going to happen, and he did officially do it shortly after that. So it looks as though that should happen pretty early in the trade period for a 4th round pick, which is in the 60s currently, so something around there. Obviously, that's still to play out, but it looks as though that's as good as done. And if you'd like to hear my thoughts on Jack Darling, you can go back to the last episode. I sort of spent 5 or 6 minutes talking about that, but broadly speaking, I think it's probably a positive thing, and at worst, it's it makes no difference. So I think that's positive. The Luke Parker talk certainly hasn't slowed down, and I think the fact that now the Swans are into the grand final means that we won't get any resolution on that, at least for another week or so. It looks as though, it's a chance because he still hasn't committed either way, and so therefore I do think he's a chance to want to leave, and who knows, maybe if he wins the grand final and he thinks, great, I've won another one with Sydney, I'll go elsewhere to finish my career. Look, who knows, potentially if he doesn't win, he wants to stick around for another year and try to get it. So we'll wait and see. I think we'll definitely have to wait until, a little while after the grand final to see if he's interested in moving. The only other one that's sort of heated up or been spoken about a little bit more is Dan Houston. And I guess for right now, all I really want to say is we do have the currency to do it. If we trade it out, our future picks to try and make something happen, I think we definitely have the currency. We could look at doing some swaps with someone like Richmond or Freo, who are going to have a lot of picks. But to be clear, I've heard no indication, there's been no official indication that he's spoken to us or he's interested in us. So it's more going to come down to whether or not the size that he is interested in and that he's talking to have the currency to do it. Carlton, for example, is one, but they don't want to use their first round pick, which I think, has to be a starting point for Dan Houston. I believe Collingwood's similar. They don't have a pick that would interest Port Adelaide. So at this stage, for me, Dan Houston seems very unlikely just because I don't know that he has any interest. But look, potentially, if the other Melbourne sides aren't able to stump up and find the draft currency, potentially we could swoop. I don't know. I think potentially he's not the best fit for us because he plays a role that we don't have a need for right now. He's that rebounding halfback that can play through the midfield. I don't know that's a need. Don't get me wrong, it would be an upgrade. It's just whether or not the juice is worth a squeeze. Like, is the draft capital that you'd have to give up to get him worth what we're upgrading is the question you'd have to ask yourself. So yeah, I mean, I'd love to have Dan Houston playing for us. I just don't know if it makes sense. But anyway, I think it's pretty unlikely anyway, given there's been no indication that he's interested. And let's be real, like, why would he be? I guess that's the that's how I'll end that chat for now. Last thing, next week, it's not even next week, the next game for the AFLW, like I've mentioned a few times, really quick turnaround. So Wednesday the 25th, they're playing a night game versus Carlton at Icon Park. So potentially when you're listening to this, it's only a day or two away. Yeah, I hope to get down there and watch potentially. Should be a really interesting game. I'm probably more interested in the team selection aspect to see if we do try and rotate a couple of players, given it's such a short turnaround. We're played Friday into Wednesday. So if you think about it from an AFL sense, that's like going Saturday into Thursday. And then we play on Sunday again. So it's 2 really short breaks back to back. I think surely we will do a little bit of rotation, particularly with those older players. Like maybe Kate Sheilor might want to have one of those games off. So that's a watch. Carlton have been belted by Richmond this weekend, so they're kind of hovering around the top of the bottom part of the 8, if that makes sense. They've got 2 wins, 2 losses, but their percentage is not good. So, we should comfortably beat them, but you just never know. You've got to turn up to play, and hopefully the girls will do that because they've been doing that for the vast majority of the quarters that we've played so far. And yeah, I think that's gonna do us for this episode. I certainly will be back to speak to you after that game. We'll have some player review podcasts dropping soon for the AFL men's, so plenty still to talk about. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I really appreciate every listener. And let's keep this positive momentum up for the girls. And yeah, we are getting very close to the actual trade period now for the AFL. So plenty going on. Stay tuned to NorthPod for all the takes and analysis and news bites that you need. And speak to you soon. Go North. Thanks for listening to another episode of NorthPod. If you give me a rating or review on your podcast service, that would be much appreciated. And please follow me on all social media at NorthPod Show. I'm on X or Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, and I'm also very active on the North Melbourne subreddit. Hope you'll join me for the next episode.